was a really interesting panel that we just came out of. So I think the theme of the panel was about CBAM and carbon accounting. And we talked mainly about, first of all, what is CBAM? It's just entered its definitive phase in January. And what does that definitive phase mean? So it's effectively the imposition of costs on imports based on their embedded emissions. So now, for the first time, a importer in the EU bringing in certain products in steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and power will have to pay for the embedded emissions in those products, the same way they would if they produced that good within the EU and had to pay a carbon cost under the EU emissions trading system. So that's just level setting of what CBAM is and what just changed over the last couple months. So now, after a long period of a transition where there was reporting required but no costs, now suddenly there are costs liabilities. So that was what's recently happened. Then we talked about some of the recent updates to the policy. So even up until December 31st, the day before the definitive phase began, there were additional communications coming from the EU government, the European Commission, about default values, which are the default emissions intensities preset for each product and country of origin. Those are used to calculate the CBAM liability. The benchmark values, which are used to set the free allocations. And additionally, there were 3 interesting new proposals that the EU put out in December, and those kind of shook things up. So one was the expansion to downstream products. And so there's a list of about 100 additional steel and aluminum products that will be added to CBAM in 2028. And that includes everything from nails and staples to industrial robots and engines. So there's a lot of variation there, a lot of complexity. So there's a couple years now for the market to get ready for that. The other 2, so the one other one was the temporary decarbonization fund. And this will be, the EU will set aside 25% of CBAM revenues and give that to domestic EU producers to support their decarbonization. So that's a wealth transfer, a financial transfer directly from third country producers who are paying their products are paying CBAM costs when they're imported into the EU, and some of that money will be going to EU producers. So there's a lot of political implications for that. It's quite controversial. Is that fair? That'll be something for people to discuss over the coming months and years. And then lastly, the third big proposal was this emergency brake, this Article 27, serious and unforeseen circumstances clause that was added that will allow the Commission to temporarily exempt certain products from CBAM if they, through monitoring, determine that prices have risen too quickly or in an unwelcome manner. They can exempt that product and then also potentially retroactively cancel costs that have already been incurred. So those are the big ones that we talked about. And then beyond that, we talked about the impact on the ETS. How will CBAM interact with the ETS? We've seen a lot of volatility with the EUA price recently over the last couple of months. I wasn't the expert on that, but I think maybe Coralie or Clavia will have more to say about that. But they were essentially saying a lot of that isn't CBAM related, although CBAM may play a part. Then we talked also about carbon accounting in general, the theme. So it's been a big topic. It was one of our key themes highlighted for 2026, which is carbon accounting. And suddenly, for the first time, this is moving from a nice-to-have voluntary effort to now something being set by regulation because there are costs associated with emissions, and therefore there needs to be standards about how to calculate those emissions. And CBAM is a big part of that. There are a lot of nitty-gritty details about what emissions count, and namely direct process emissions at a facility level, what doesn't count in many sectors. That would be indirect scope 2 emissions from power usage, although wrinkle, it does apply for a couple of sectors, fertilizers and cement. So there are all these kind of nuances that are being set by the CBAM regulation. And so we discussed that, and also the potential for the regulation to expand over time where the EU has flagged that they want to add some additional EU ETS sectors by around 2030, and the big priority there would be for organic chemicals and refined products. So there were a lot of questions in the audience about that. Will that happen? How will that work? Is that feasible? And that's where I highlighted the three things that the EU has identified as the determinants of whether a sector should be added to CBAM, and it's the emissions intensity. So the more emissions involved in a production of a good, the more likely it should be added. The trade intensity, so if it's a more highly traded product, more likely to be added. And then finally, the feasibility. So how complex is the supply chain and the production process, and is it really feasible to determine the emissions intensity of a specific product and a specific cargo? So all of those come into the EU's decision of what sectors to include. And it looks like the priority will be organic chemicals and refined products over the coming years. So I think that just about covers it. There's other stuff, but it's always a lot of interesting things going on about CBAM. And last thing that actually I just to say is the next thing to look out for from the European Commission is communication about third country carbon pricing. So how will they handle the emissions trading markets in other countries? CBAM theoretically allows the netting out of an effective carbon price paid at origin, but how exactly that works in practice is a big question with major implications, and hopefully we'll be hearing about that this quarter.